20th of March, thousands of angry citizens took to the streets, voicing their dissent and running battles with the police. These scenes are from all four corners of Africa.
The country is without institutions, without an assembly, without a judicial body, without anything. We have come to defend our revolution.
The way things are going, I don't think there will be election in this nation.
We do have a power that is afraid and is in the process of pushing back democracy.
We are here trying to fight for our rights. Yeah. So life is so hard.
This is a banana republic and we are the monkeys. So we must eat the bananas.
And they have one thing in common. All of them are anti-government protests, and those participating in them seek immediate constitutional reforms. Countries in the four prime points of Africa are facing extreme unrest. Citizens of Kenya in the east, South Africa in the south, Nigeria and Senegal in the west, and Tunisia in the north. With a combined population of 343 million, people in these countries hit the streets over economic woes and political strife. Led by opposition leaders, the protests call out the respective governments' inaction to address concerns afflicting their countries. Can these unrests be compared to the Arab Spring? Beginning in December 2010, anti-government protests spread like wildfire across the Arab world. It began in Tunisia in response to corruption and economic stagnation. By early 2011, the protests had spread across Arabic-speaking countries in North Africa and the Middle East. The pro-democratic protests ended up toppling the governments of Tunisia, Egypt, Libya and Yemen.
Whether this is inspired or will mirror the Arab Spring, I think there's quite a lot of military might in Africa among some of these regimes, and I think the people may be scared. But at some stage, desperation will trump fear, and people will say, I've got nothing to lose. If you don't make peaceful revolutions possible, you make violent revolutions inevitable. And I think that's where Africa is positioned.
At the union buildings in the capital Pretoria, the seat of the government, police and troops were on patrol. Demonstrators were expected to turn up in large numbers.
Businesses cannot grow. Assembly lines cannot run.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa deployed over 3,400 National Defence Force troops for crime prevention and preservation of law and order to support the police force. This is how the country braced up for protests after its third largest party, Economic Freedom Fighters or EFF, urged South Africans to take to the streets and call for a national shutdown.
To demand the resignation of Cyril Ramaphosa, who has presided over the misery of our people in South Africa, the massive unemployment, 11.8 million people are unemployed.
The incident revived memories of the deadly riots of July 2021. It was the worst violence since the end of apartheid in South Africa. The arrest of ex-President Jacob Zuma morphed into an outpouring of anger over inequality, killing at least 350 people. Cut to the 20th of March this year, thousands of protesters marched through South Africa's cities in Pretoria, Cape Town and Johannesburg, calling on President Ramaphosa to resign over the lack of jobs and shortage of electricity. Nat Joints, the country's national intelligence body, said in a statement that more than 550 protesters were arrested on charges of public violence, intimidation, damage to critical infrastructure, and theft.
Even before COVID, South Africa was experiencing grave economic problems. And with the pandemic, which was handled quite badly by himself and the South African government, we had very severe lockdowns. And we had a lot of people put out of work or businesses compromised. And further to that, we've had what we call rolling blackouts, electricity blackouts, in the last few years. But almost on a daily basis over this year, we've had that.
Let's understand the core issue. South Africa, a country of about 60 million, has been battling a critical energy crisis. Analysts say it could lose $13 billion due to load shedding alone this year. The power shortages have deeply amplified resentment in a country battered by unemployment and soaring inflation. South Africans have also faced a prolonged economic slump with no hope of recovery.
How do I pay my workers? How do I pay my rent? How do I go forward buying stock? Very difficult. It put me through a stressful time, when I'm being honest, no lies about it. Very stressful, I ended up having a heart attack due to the stress.
I have a dream of being a fashion designer, and I feel like the load shedding has been affecting us for a long time now, and I feel like the government has failed us somehow, because as the youth we've been struggling for a long time, and I feel like the government has to stand up, and instead of eating the money and doing everything, I feel like the poor is actually suffering. And if you look at it, the hospitals are relying on the oxygen that's being pumped by the electricity.
We've had citizens, most of us have been without electricity for up to 12 hours, and that is causing a lot of damage to the economy. I read a report earlier today that says we are expecting that this will cost the economy 13 billion rand in this year, and that's very serious in an economy that is experiencing 0.3% growth rate. That was one of also the greatest motivators for people to take to the streets and then occupy the president's house, because there was no electricity.
In Kaberia, a division of the Nairobi area in Kenya, protesters chanted "Ruto must go." They blocked roads and set tires on fire. Police officers clad in riot gear fired tear gas at hundreds of protesters. Several people were arrested, including 2 opposition members of parliament. Demonstrators dispersed in other parts of the country, including Kisumu, the 3rd largest city in Kenya. This is the place where a university student was shot dead during the anti-government protests. The demonstrations are led by Kenya's opposition leader, Raila Odinga, who lost in the last general elections. The former Prime Minister also announced the beginning of protests to resist what he calls a high cost of living. Odinga claims that he won the presidential race in August last year and will never acknowledge William Ruto as a legitimate president.
Former deputy president is now the current president after winning an election which was contested up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that the election was free and fair. But now this means also that the opposition is not happy. 7 months after the election, they are not happy with the results. And for it, it's more of an accountability issue. They're saying the cost of living is high, there's a lot of unemployment, the new president is not keeping the promises.
Many Kenyans feel that President Ruto hasn't delivered on pledges to help the working class. With a sharp drop in local shilling against the dollar, Kenyans are suffering from surging prices for basic necessities. An ongoing drought has also left millions hungry.
The issues around cost of living, the climate crisis, which has seen many Kenyans are now battling hunger and starvation in northern Kenya, and they have nothing to eat. I visited a village in northern Kenya whereby we have men who have resorted to marrying off their daughters as young as 14, 15, because they tell me they cannot be able to feed them. I feel most of the protests are largely to do with accountability of political leaders. There's an attachment to food and how people are going to survive. The cost of living is very high. Most families cannot feed themselves across the continent.
Nigeria too has been in a churn since the declaration of veteran politician Bola Tinubu as president in February this year. Hundreds of supporters of Nigeria's opposition People's Democratic Party chanted that Abubakar won the vote. They also claimed that there were irregularities in the elections that led to Tinubu's rise, subverting the will of the people of Nigeria.
Our candidate won, and is a fair and peaceful man. That is why we said, let's come to INEC peacefully. Let's tell them that this is what we want, this is what Nigerians want. Since they declared the other man president, the whole country has been in mourning. So you should know that they robbed us, they raped us.
The opposition candidates Atiku Abubakar and Peter Obi led protests against both the polls and the rising cost of living in the West African nation of 290 million. Meanwhile, Tinubu has called for unity and says he wants all parties to work with him.
Nigeria is a special case because Nigeria has just come from an election that was hotly contested as well. And many of the people are not happy with the person who won the election. They are complaining of election malpractices. This is why they are kind of protesting, so that they try to add pressure and see if they can get a different outcome from that election process, or perhaps if their legal systems can be able to accommodate. It's Africa's largest democracy, and therefore to them they feel their ego has really been brutalized. But we'll have to wait and see what really happened.
In Dakar, Senegal's capital, demonstrators burned tires and set fire to buses and a large supermarket, shaking Senegal's reputation as a bastion of a stable democracy. Clashes began when hundreds of protesters surrounded the car taking presidential hopeful Ousmane Sonko to the courthouse as police in riot gear encircled the area.
The international community should know this is how Senegal is. The true face of Senegal is the dictatorship of President Macky Sall and police repression.
Opposition leader Sonko, who came third in the 2019 presidential election, is facing trial for alleged defamation. He denies all wrongdoing and says accusations are politically motivated to stop him from running in the 2024 polls. Much of the anger on the street is targeted toward President Macky Sall, whose failure to rule out running for a third term in office has enraged many. In Tunisia, a nation of 12 million, thousands marched in the streets of the capital, Tunis. They are protesting against President Kais Saied's perceived autocratic rule. Protesters want Saied to resign for orchestrating what they feel was a coup in July last year, pushing for unpopular constitutional amendments. These angry demonstrations are organized mostly by the Islamist Ennahda party and a movement that calls itself Citizens Against the Coup.
If you look at Tunisia, you look at Senegal, more or less it's about an accountability issue. People are beginning to get fed up with politicians heaping promises and not keeping those promises. So it's like a wind of some sort of revolution that is now blowing across the African continent. And people want to see change. People are tired with living with unemployment, with food issues, with global health systems being dilapidated.
The number of demonstrations in 5 countries in Africa at present implies a growing trend of dissatisfaction amongst citizens over economic crisis and other political disagreements. But the situation wasn't always this grim. Prior to 2020, African countries were among the fastest growing in the world. Many economies in sub-Saharan Africa grew at a record pace before the pandemic. It was COVID-19 pandemic that reversed decades of governance gains on the continent. Africa's Human Development Index dropped for the first time in almost 3 decades. Millions of Africans lost their jobs. 50 million were projected to be pushed into extreme poverty. Global trade disruptions hampered growth. Many African countries suffered from a shrinking fiscal space.
I think an analysis of where Africa is today and the protests and the unrest and unhappiness we're seeing has been exacerbated by 2 things. Firstly, the COVID-19 crisis, which has actually just amplified poverty. People haven't had a chance to breathe and recover. So I think the escalation of prices and the shortages of vital products has been a big trigger in I think putting people into the street.
On February 24, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in an act of aggression. The aftershocks of the war were felt around the world, including in Africa. It derailed Africa's slow recovery from COVID-19. The Russia-Ukraine war raised food and fuel prices, disrupted trade of goods and services, and reduced the flow of development funds to the continent.
Africa largely depends on wheat that comes from Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine has really affected the wheat production. In the last 10, 15 years, Kenya, for example, has traditionally now become a wheat-dependent Ukraine, donated 30,000 metric tons of wheat to Kenya. So it is a shame that a country is at war, yet it's feeding us. That is why people are on the streets. They know things are bad.
Africa is the world's richest yet poorest continent. Nearly half the world's gold and 1/3 of all minerals are in Africa. But it's also a traumatized continent. Communities across Africa are facing the worst food crisis seen in 40 years. Factors such as climate change, the war in Ukraine, rising inflation around the world, and a surge in global food prices have caused devastating ripples across the continent. And the recent protests indicate a rising disconnect between the government and citizens. The region has evolved to become a focal point of world politics. So, have the ongoing protests drawn any international reactions, especially from the West and China?
China has an interference policy in issues of other countries. Everyone wants to have investments at stake. Everyone wants to have their armies within the African continent, to establish military bases in the name of partnerships. They will raise their concerns through the diplomatic channels, but they will not be quick to take political sides, because most of these issues are between government and oppositions. And trust you me, there's no country that wants to be seen to be supporting the opposition.
Over a decade ago, much of the Arab world erupted in protests against dictatorial regimes. The Arab uprisings unseated 4 presidents. It offered hope of a wave of democratic change across the Middle East and North Africa. It was a powerful force. Once again, protests against government policies are roiling all 4 corners of Africa. How will they go down in history?